Good afternoon and welcome to Planet Native 2022. My name is Stacia Stelk and I'm the Executive Director of Deep Roots, and welcome to our 4th annual conference. Without our sponsors, we could not bring you Planet Native, and so I'd like to give a brief shout out to those who helped bring this to light this year. Thank you to our platinum sponsor, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and our gold sponsors, DCA, Colonial Gardens, and the Miller Hammond Charitable Fund. Special thanks to our silver sponsors, Evergy Green Team, Gale Hart Communities, Montage Liberty, Habitat Architects, the Missouri Department of Conservation, the Missouri Wildflower Nursery, and Ripple Glass. And finally, thanks to our bronze sponsors, Forest Keeling Nursery, Izell Native Plants, the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, KC Can Compost, the Mark Water Quality Public Education Committee, Print Forest, Red River Valley Design, So Wild Natives, Vireo, and Wild Honey Farms. We also could not bring you Planet Native without the Deep Roots team. Tammy Thompson is Deep Roots Outreach Manager and the Master of Planet Native. Jahida Aguilar is our Project Coordinator, and Miller Ziders is our intern. Thank you, team, for all of your hard work. At this time, I would like to invite Eric Chance, Director Emeritus of Powell Gardens, Kansas City's Botanical Gardens, to the stage to introduce our opening keynote speaker.
Thank you, Stacia. It is an honor today to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Rick Darke. Rick is a Pennsylvania native consultant based in Pennsylvania. He's an author and a photographer. His work is grounded in an observational ethic that blends ecology, horticulture, and cultural geography in the design and stewardship of the living landscapes. Rick's collaborative projects include parks, post-industrial sites, transportation corridors, conservation developments, residential developments, and botanical gardens. And that's how I had the honor of meeting him many years ago. He's a prolific author, and his books include The American Woodland Gardens, Capturing the Spirit of the Deciduous Forest, The Living Landscape, Designing for Beauty and Biodiversity in the Home Garden, co-authored with Doug Tallamy, one of our past speakers to Planet Native, and Gardens of the Highline, Elevating the Nature of Modern Landscapes, co-authored with Pete Odulf. Rick, welcome to Planet Native.
Thanks, Eric. It's good to be working with you again. I have fond memories of times I get out to Kansas and Missouri to see you at the garden. And it's a wonderful world that we're in, this world of gardens and public landscapes and private landscapes, and I'm very happy to be part of this conference today. If those of you that actually read the material in there, I don't always do this, but my goal today is to present the concepts of what a garden could be if it's really truly well made and full of life that's both human and otherwise. A garden that provides that experience of multiple living processes. It's not something that we usually start with when we talk about garden design or plant choices, but we should. And especially I want to talk today about the idea of inviting wildness into your landscape. Authentic wildness is the most rewarding way to create a truly vibrant landscape that will sustain both you and an array of regional biodiversity. Usually in horticulture, the tack is you design a garden and you get a bunch of plants and you put them out there in fixed patterns, and then you flail away trying to keep them in those patterns. And what I'm going to be talking about today is a really slightly different approach to it. It's not that there isn't order, that you don't establish it, but you don't say, we just got to keep it that way. You welcome a wildness, you welcome an autonomy in a number of these living things that you're sharing the landscape with. And you with that, you get managed self-perpetuating plant communities that have resiliency. They can come back, they can repair, they can heal, and they are entertaining because they're always changing. And it does take a bit of a refocus to kind of give up that total control that is at the heart of some landscape architecture and say, it's a lot more interesting if we really let it be a dynamic, managed landscape. I'd like to ask you, I'm going to ask you a number of questions through this presentation. How many of you know the technical term for the strategic intervention into the living dynamics of plant communities? I know you can't answer me, but you can answer it for yourself. The term is gardening. And with that, I'm going to turn my video off so you can concentrate on what I'm going to show you. And I'm going to be using Apple's Keynote program today, not PowerPoint. I know that's a great disappointment, but Keynote is much better with video. So moving from my screen to the program, this is actually where I'm speaking from today. This shot was taken in May. I'm in an acre and a half in the suburbs. I'd like to think I'm in the wilds of the country, but I know better than that. I'm only an hour from Philadelphia, an hour from Baltimore, 2 hours from New York City, and 2 hours from Washington, D.C. We're in southeastern Pennsylvania. The climate here is actually not that different than yours if you are in Missouri or Kansas and adjacent states. We do get temperatures, at least we used to get temperatures below zero. We get temperatures over 100 sometimes. We've got about 40 inches of rainfall here most years. Melinda, my wife, Melinda Zor, who is also same as Eric, a graduate of the Longwood Graduate Program in Botanic Garden Management, she and I have been working on this property for 30 years. We're not quite as peripatetic in terms of our residences as most Americans. We've stayed put for a long time because we live next to 9,000 acres of preserve, which would have been underwater had the DuPont company had its way. Instead, it wound up being a preserve, and that's what keeps us here. We love that. We love the wildness that it offers. And this landscape that you're looking at is an acre and a half where two people do all of the maintenance, or all of the care, if you will, except the very largest tree work, and we even do quite a bit of that. We do not irrigate beyond establishment. We use no herbicides or pesticides beyond the occasional utilization of poison ivy to kill a native plant. You can guess which one that is. It's poison ivy. We do have some areas of turf. If you see the New York Times, there was a big article last week at the front page about clover lawns. Not news to us because that's what this is, but that lawn is really basically not had anything done except mulching, mowing for 30 years. And you can see there are a lot of layers in there. We garden in sync with our place. We use primarily, but not exclusively, regional indigenous species, call them native plants if you'd like. And so if you're doing that, and you're working with local process, for you and for me, in May, the landscape looks green. It's not full of flower color, especially from a little distance. You might have things blooming, but the predominant color is from photosynthesis. Now, if you look at that exact same landscape, and these are two shots from this is last year in fall, that landscape goes quite from green to all kinds of colors. There's flower color in there, there are asters in there, there are other things that are visible that are blooming, but for the most part, it's foliage color. And that could even be just worm season grasses, and this counts. One of the things that I've recognized over the years is that the hardest thing in getting people to use more native plants is realizing that they've got to give up on this kind of a landscape approach. This is a photograph of this property when I first saw it in 1988 and got it shortly after that. This is the typical suburbs in Pennsylvania, and I know it's this way in a lot of the Midwest. It's lawn from the street to the house, a few ill-chosen woody plants out there. If you love riding around on a mower, then it's a great thing for you, but it's really not that sensitive or that smart ecologically. And so this is what we started with here. And in little ways, we have been working all these years, it's decades now, to try to, given our resources, move towards a more richly layered landscape, a landscape that's really going to sustain us, allow us to work within our resources, both time and money, and to introduce native plants that will sustain native wildlife, because this is a really big thing for us, and is becoming more important, I imagine, for most of you. Certainly the general public, you can see it in all the literature. Everybody wants more birds in the garden. They want more butterflies. They want more pollinators. They want the water to be clean. This is what it looks like when you start doing this. Now, in this case, I've started, I don't have a gym membership. I try to get my exercise in the garden. So I've been out there with a sharp spade, and I took up that turf in the front, put it in our composting area off to the side. And I've planted divisions of aster. This is the white wood aster. I'm still going to call it Aster divaricata, so you can call it Eurybia divaricata if you'd like to. And I got seedlings from our property and from a very friendly neighbor across the street, seedlings of sassafras. I put those in there more than a quarter century ago. That photograph is that old. It's almost 30 years old. And we just set this in motion. Now, in that time, it's almost full sun, but it didn't take that long before we had a complete cover on the ground of that white wood aster. And you can see the sassafras are growing up. Now, over time, it's become this. And if you look at this, you see sassafras now, some of which have got 6-8 inch caliper. The aster is still there. There's a juniper, a red cedar that's grown up. There's a dogwood in the photograph. This is if you can see my mouse moving there, that's a dogwood. That's Cornus Florida. That's a local plant for us. And it's been blooming for the last few years. This is what's called a back of the bird plant. And I think probably most of you can guess at what I'm talking about. This literally came out of the back of a bird. The process is we start back at this point, taking up some turf, planting sassafras seedlings, planting divisions of this local aster. It covers the ground, the trees grow up, the birds sit in the tree, and they do something that rhymes with sitting. And you wind up with a free dogwood. And if you look at what this will be like in about 2 weeks, this is a shot from last fall, but there is a early October shot from last fall with the asters blooming, the dogwoods turning color, and there's a Solidago rugosa out there. That's actually the cultivar fireworks. And there's the road. The front of our garden goes right by the road. That aster has been doing most of our weeding now for going on 30 years. To me, that's a good thing. I love the garden. I like tending the garden. I'm not crazy about weeding. There's so many other things to do in life. There's that fireworks in the front. And if you look at the mix here, your eye either says, wow, that's beautiful, or it's a little chaotic, it's a little messy. And that's the other issue. As we grow into using more native plants, we need to relax if we're not already there. And you can do this with, alcohol or drugs or just talking to yourself. There is beauty in here, there's meaning in here, there's function in here, but it's not the kind of order that most people in horticulture are used to. Most humans see order in straight lines or fixed radius curves, things that are very predictable, very pat, very rote, very static. And when you move into an order that is much more complex like this, that is actually what you need to do if you're going to be managing plant communities. Now, I looked at the program. It's a wonderful mixed program with a lot of people looking at very, very closely intertwined or interwoven concepts that are required if we're really going to, all of us, be growing more native plants. And if you look at this image in autumn, of that same section of the driveway, you can see the edge of the driveway and you see a little strip of grass there. For about 15 years, I worked with Sue Barton and Gary Schwetz and a couple of other colleagues locally here. We work with DelDOT, the Department of Transportation for Delaware, which is an adjacent state. It's a mile from here. And we learned that when we were bringing native plants to Delaware's roadsides, if we let those plantings go right up to the edge of the road, people driving, they put down their drinks, they put down their sandwich, they got the phone out, and they called their representative to complain. We learned that we had to have some cue that said, we didn't just let this go. It's not neglect. It's deliberate. It's intentional. There's meaning and usefulness to it. We came to facetiously call that the beauty strip, but it's really important, especially in residential neighborhoods or places with HOAs where you might have some kind of a covenant, to let people know, you know what you're doing it deliberately, you're respecting boundaries, you're going to be neat enough where it matters. Like in this case, you can open the car door and not step into the plantings. But beyond that, is a whole realm of autonomous, semi-wild plants that are going to sustain a whole lot of life. This photograph is not tricked, as none of these photographs that you'll see have been tricked or photoshopped. I did not put that Subaru in there, but I did wait until a Subaru came by that was the same color as the dogwood. Now that's the garden. And if that day I went out into the woods a mile from here into the White Clay Creek Preserve, and I took this shot. So you can see how similar the colors, the patterns, the layering are, even though the scale of our garden, it's only 1.5 acres, and this is a 9,000 acre preserve. But we really are modeling in many direct ways on what is our regional landscape. That regional landscape is not virgin forest. I have never in my life, and I never will in my life, see virgin forest. We are at least in tertiary, if not quaternary or beyond that, regrowth from forests that have been logged, either clear cut or partially logged. In this case, there's order in this landscape. And part of what I do as a design consultant is over the years, I've just learned enough about plants, the way they grow, and about landscapes to be able to quickly read what has happened. Basically, you need to be able to look at patterns and components and know what has likely been happening with that living landscape. So if you look in the foreground here, this straight line, that is where the railroad went through. And those trees and all those shrubs and everything else that's in there, they just took advantage when the tracks were pulled out in the late 1920s. So they filled in. This is regenerative vegetation because it happened in the 20s before most of our weeds were introduced by humans. It's mostly native stuff. You see this other line over here? That's not a railroad. And if your eye is tuned, you see slope here. That is a waterway. That's the White Clay Creek. Learning to look at these lines in the landscape and interpret them is the first step in really being able to read and understand so that you can then take action. This is the landscape. I'm in a helicopter here. It's about 1 mile from our house. That's the old 1700s carriage road leading into the University of Delaware in Newark, Delaware. You can see it's a patchwork. There's still a lot of agriculture around here. There are farm ponds, there are farms, there's lots of suburbs. There's little bits of trees. This is something I'm proud to say. We're in a township that has a 50% set aside. So if anybody wants to do any kind of a development here, they can do it. But they have to set 50% of that land aside for public open space. And this is a pocket park that I worked on with other colleagues and with our only 3 supervisors in the London Britton Township Supervisory Board. But it is composed of 100 acres of land that's both woodland and open grassland that was a farm. That's my wife, a landscape architect friend of ours, and dog out there. Now, I want you to just read this quote and guess, when was it written? Thousands of tired, nerve-shaken, over-civilized people have found that wildness is a necessity. It sounds to me like it could be yesterday or any time since the pandemic really got people in full cabin fever mode, over-civilized and nerve-shaken and tired and overworked or underworked. And there is a bit of a mitigating possibility, and that is a little bit of loosening, a little bit of wildness, not wilderness. There's quite a difference. Wilderness is just a fiction. There never was wilderness, there never will be. There's wildness. This is not a place where we are not. This is a place where there is a lot of autonomy in all the living things. That quote was not written recently. That quote was written in 1901 by John Muir. Sometimes all it takes when you're making a garden of native plants or not, all it takes is to say, I'm going to put a path in it, and I'm going to put a bench in it, a place to sit, a place to contemplate, a place to be. And that's what we did in this park. There is actually a path through there. It's covered by the snow right now. This has become a very much beloved pocket park in our township. That's what it looked like when we started. There's the woodlands on the right, and this is about 75 acres here, 50 acres, well, a little bit less than 50 acres of woodlands. And originally, the development was going in there And the township started with a CREP program, and many of you are familiar with it. It's a government, it's federal funded program to plant trees with the idea of reforesting, but it's based upon a forestry model, a productive forestry model, not on a layered landscape model. And of course, the township didn't have any horticulturists or foresters on crews, so they plant all these things out there. They're in rows, as CREP is likely to lead you, and they're hitting these tubes. The neighbors hate it because they were saying the tubes look like a cemetery and they just wanted it out of there. And so they brought me and my colleagues, Sue Barton and Gary, in to look at it. And I said, start over again. It had been an alfalfa field. I said, let's drill seed it to warm season grasses, Indian grass, big blue stem primarily. We got lucky. We hired a firm to use a Truax drill and drill seed that. And the first season, it was looking good, and it has been good now for 15 years or more. There it is about mid-season with all these grasses growing up. There's a lot of change in it. There's a lot of dynamics. There's a lot of beauty in it. I recommended that they plant it in grasses and then plant trees either adjacent to the walkways or in savanna-like clusters to ease the management of this. There is a woodland viewpoint, so that if people want to get immersed in the woods or just escape the full sun of the grasslands and get in the shade, they can do that. Here's a shot in winter showing the trees with remnant grasses left like this. The idea is you're going to mow or weed whack those grasses every 5, 6, 7 years, but the curves to mow this with the township, which just has big mowers, are such that the radius of this fit those machines. So it's really easy care, doesn't require a lot of knowledge, but it sustains the trees. Those grasses won't keep the deer out. And of course, we have deer like crazy, but they will give it some buffer. And this is what it's become over the years. It's a wonderful place. I mean, Melinda and I use this place, even though we were involved in creating it. There it is going into the woods. It has a lot of change in light. There's all kinds of different things that you can see if you get used to it in different seasons. We are lucky to still have a lot of agriculture in the area, so we can get a little bit of big sky country by being out in that park. Now, switching to the Midwest. This is actually Nebraska, but it's landscapes that I know very well and love. I did study and work with grasses for many years. I still know them, but they're no longer the singular focus they were when I was doing encyclopedias. But these landscapes they're cultivated landscapes, and like if you get at this Salvia azurea, that's a bit of kind of the legacy landscape, because most of the big prairie scapes that we see, these plants are gone from them. They are existing in areas, but we need to go out and get them and reconstitute them, as they've done in many places, including the Shaw. I love this plant. Here it is growing on the edge of a roadside. It's taking refuge because big agriculture is not conducive to providing habitat for this, but along the roadside, it can live. Now, this is a photograph I took a couple of winters ago visiting a friend in Maine, and there's a hawk up in that tree. You can look at this and say, oh, there's a good full moon, but otherwise it's a pretty boring landscape. It's just a bunch of browns and tans and maybe a little blue reflected on the snow or the ice. It's now a rail trail. It's a wonderful landscape in Maine, open to the public. But it reminded me of a book that I learned of when I was studying the arts and crafts movement. It's called Color Problems, a practical manual for the lay student of color. It's about people who are painting landscapes out of doors, plein air painters. There are charts in it like this. I love it. Sky is the top, snow and sunshine, shadows on snow, dead grass through snow. Crows is the thin black line, pardon my voice. Dried oak leaves, tree trunks light, pine green, tree trunks dark. It's a color scheme from a winter landscape. In that, using deft swatches of watercolor, the author has pictured a bare woods on the edge of a meadow, just like our little Flint Hill Crossing Park, or a color note from a bluebird. These are exercises that help us to see, and I know that over the time that I've been working with this and trying to promote the use of native plants and the conservation of regional landscapes, the biggest lift, the heaviest lift has been to get people to see differently. And so if you can see this, share your insights with your neighbors and your colleagues, or just look a little deeper and learn what it is really like to go from these abstracts into the real thing. That was the garden. This is the garden. This is just right off our kitchen. For us, we love these things and we count these colors. I mean, the blue on that is just as important as the blue would be in any kind of a flowering plant. When I was doing the Encyclopedia of Grasses, the second version of it, I knew by then how hard it was to convince people to grow grasses. They were called ornamental grasses then. They're just grasses, native grasses here. That's Schizocarium, Scoparium there. And I learned that the best way to get people to accept them or welcome them or celebrate them, especially in winter, was to use an avatar. So this fox is my avatar. This is a trained fox up on Cape Cod one winter that posed for me, allowing me to get this shot to say every color in the coat of that beautiful animal is in the landscape. And it's so much easier for most people to look at that animal and study it than they are able to look at that landscape, which might seem messy or not structured. Of course, it's highly structured, it's highly ordered, it's highly functional. There's that fox in that book. Now I'm gonna do a few things that are kind of be interactive tests for you. I know that you can't speak back to me right now, but I want you to answer these questions for yourself. So this is a half a mile from the house. That's the White Clay Creek going through the woods. You have 10 seconds to memorize that image. I'm watching the clock. Okay, many of you know that those are water striders, not water spiders. They do not have feet, they have legs, and at the bottom of their legs or the end of their legs are microhairs, which allow them to distribute their weight in such a way that this animal can do something that humans have been trying to do for years, mostly not successfully. It can walk on water. So I was out there that day thinking, I've always wanted to walk on water, and some days I'd rather be a water strider than a human. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, wait a minute now. You start off in the morning with your microhairs clean, you head out there and start walking around or sliding around in the water, and by lunchtime, your microhairs are completely clogged with organic debris. You can see all the organic debris on the top of the water. These are just my shots into the White Clay Creek. Well, actually, I'm misleading you. There's nothing stuck to the legs of that insect. What's going on here? What are you looking at? If you press down on a reflective surface like water on a sunny day, and you don't break that surface tension, you create convex mirrors. And in those mirrors is that image that I asked you to memorize. In those mirrors is a reflection of the 100-foot tall canopy that we started off with. There's so much detail out there, we just don't take the time to notice. And I love doing stuff like this. I've tried this on 8-year-olds and it works. A lot of children are still at the age where they have not yet learned to filter out the familiar, which is filtering out the familiar is a survival technique that adults learn on their way to getting really boring and not doing a whole lot of stuff. But kids see everything. They look at everything. They're not distracted by saying, I think I know it all already. I'm not going to look. We need to look. And when I was at Longwood, as much as I love Longwood Gardens, for a lot of things, I didn't love it for the kind of garden that I wanted to make at home. So I could do gardens at Longwood, and it was good because they were different than my own personal taste. I made an effort to go back to the source to learn about native plants in environments. That left shot is the American Woodland Garden book that actually has a shot of Longwood Gardens, Pierce's Woods Garden, which was an exercise in working with native plants. But I did a book that had a forest aesthetic in it and a core chapter, Learning from a Woodland Stream, which had a study that was almost 20 years old by the time I did that book 20 years ago. I picked a bunch of places and decided I'd try to photograph them as many times as I could in a year. This is the Red Clay Creek, 15 miles from my house, but on my way to Longwood. And I started photographing it in March of 1983. I took it, this is slides, actual film slides, 64 ASO Kodachrome. I cast the image up on a wall, sketched it with a piece of paper, and labeled all of the plants after doing a herbarium vouchered inventory of the plants that were growing along that creek. And then I just studied it. I just watched it. I stopped every time I could to take photographs. And I learned about the periodicities, about the temporal dimension of a landscape that's constantly morphing, constantly changing in little ways and big ways. And I learned to see a lot of that process. The biennial flowering of dogwoods, I have proof, I have photographic proof that it actually is a real thing. I learned things that I was unprepared for. In this shot, the light is flat and even. In this shot, it's a May morning, the light has gotten strong. We're coming into early, time of year when the sun has got strength, and it casts shadows. So I put a note in my notebook that morning that I'd lost the depth of my scene, thinking, when am I going to get it back? Well, it wasn't going to be next fall or something when the leaves fell or the sun got dimmer. It was that afternoon, because this is the morning and that's the afternoon. And it started teaching me about light, about mood. I've asked people sometimes in design symposia, let's just look at these two things and say, what is their emotional value? What is their intellectual value? Instead of just simply, what are the plants in there and what are the patterns of the plants? These are other things that we need to take to heart when we're thinking about what populates a landscape, what makes it come alive, what keeps it alive, what keeps it changing, what keeps it being intriguing. I had made a pact with myself to photograph it in all seasons. So I took photographs like this when we normally wouldn't go out. We're always fair weather friends of gardens. Every picture is always when it looks beautiful, nothing's wrong, it's not raining, snowing, or muddy, or flooding. But I learned from that simple process of just revisiting a place and trying to look deeper and deeper, working on my visual acuity, that I learned about process. I learned about the hopefulness that, things change. Maybe they change for the better. Maybe they don't change for the better. But, give it time. Give it time. It will come around. New trees, new islands. Now, you take something like that and you go back to a landscape at the periphery. This is my helicopter shot taken about 5 miles from that creek. And there's the woodlands at the background. That's, again, tertiary regrowth, but it's the woods. But this suburban landscape, which Doug and I used in the Living Landscape book, is a pretty sterile landscape. And I did not have to fly around in circles waiting for a time when there was not a human out there using that landscape. In fact, the whole time we were out there, I didn't see anybody in the landscape. So all this lawn that's mowed, all those plantings, they're really not making environments where people live. They live inside their houses. Just to prove it to you, Melinda and I are dirt gardeners. We do our own work. We love the touch and feel of it. We know it. And to some extent, I know that there's a bit of a problem with some of what we are promoting, and that we are knowledgeable people. So when we're working with the complex dynamics of living systems of regional plants, we have a lot more than the general public has. And I would like to think I'll live long enough to see our field grow a whole crop of young people who are lookers, who are observers, who get to know these plants and their processes such that they can advise people. Because I'm at the stage now where I'm getting a lot of people saying, can you tell me who does this kind of work? And I just don't have enough people to recommend them to. It's really important to make a note of what you're doing if you're a designer or if you're just a home gardener. This is me not having a good time taking down a Paul's double scarlet hawthorn that was planted by the previous owners. In this landscape, they planted it in 1951 and it had thorns that would take your eye out. But they also planted that oak, which Woody Sengels, who's the postmaster in New York, dug up in 1951 from his sister's property and planted it as a bare root plant. We left that tree. And to give you an orientation, there I am out in this landscape the year that I first got this property. There's that tree. Now keep it in mind, I'm going to show you what we did. And this is what the landscape looked like in a little bit more than a decade. Same tree. There's the tree on the left. And so what we're doing here is we're saying, all right, we're going to work without irrigation. We're going to work with primarily native plants. We're going to work to try to conserve as much as we can. And we also are of the opinion that if the mulch is showing, That's your failure as a designer and a horticulturist and an ecologist. You notice there's no mulch showing. If there's anything that's brown on the ground, it's organic material. It's leaves. I took this photograph, and Doug and I used it in the Living Landscape book. Having taken 1 million slides, well, really literally 75,000 slides, I know that scanning slides is a fool's errand. It's not much fun. But when you do, you very often get digital artifacts. That dot in the center is not from a scanned slide. This is a digital shot from a helicopter. That is a blue heron with a 4+ foot wide wingspan, 250 feet below my craft and 50 feet above the water. And Doug and I used it in the Living Landscape because we wanted an image without words that would say, have a little humility. These systems are big and they're complex, and we are just a part of it. We can be a destructive part of it or a constructive part of it. And part of being constructive is accepting that the ground layer, in many cases, needs to look like this. It's got to have dead leaves and fungus and bacteria and all kinds of stuff, springtails and creepy crawlies and snails and centipedes and ants. This is all of what makes up a highly functional ground layer. Okay, back to question and answer time. This is a test for you. That's already 4 seconds. You've got 6 seconds left to memorize that image. Take a look at it very carefully. Okay, what was the butterfly? How many of you saw a butterfly in that image? I've used that same image with young people in a plants and human culture course that I co-teach at the University of Delaware with Sue Barton. And in 10 seconds, on average, out of 50 people, 15 of them see the butterfly. Now, that's not a still image. That is the first frame of a video that I took with my iPhone because I didn't have my camera with me that day, but I saw something I wanted to capture. If I make it move, you will immediately become focused on what I want you to see, which is a morning cloak butterfly, one of relatively few native or regionally indigenous butterflies that overwinter in leaves, not leaf litter. Don't call it litter. It's just leaves. It's the natural accumulation of organic matter on the ground. And so when you see that, if you say, oh my God, time to get the leaf blower out, let's get some nice, evenly, textured mulch with the same color and stuff in there, don't do it. It's the worst thing that's happened to our industry, this whole mow and blow and mulch culture that is being propagated everywhere. Those of you old enough to remember Gary Snyder, he's still alive, a Californian who's been writing about nature, if you will, but at least the larger sphere of things, that complex web of life. This is my favorite quote of all of his nature quotes. That which appears to be chaotic in nature is only a more complex kind of order. There's order here. The easy way to describe this order is in the center of it, there's the creek. And one of those lines, the one to the left, is the old carriage road. And in this case, this is 1760s. On the right is the railroad. Now, I've used this image for years to get people to say, all right, what direction is the water flowing? And I make it harder. And I've used this in that class too. I make it harder by saying to all of you, what direction is the water flowing? And you may not use gravity as your primary reasoning. I want you to give me a reason for why you think the water is flowing away from us, which it is, or towards us, based upon something you can observe in the living dynamics of that plant community. And the first time I did this, it's got to be 5 or 6 years ago. And this course fulfills a multicultural requirement and a science requirement. So we get a lot of non-majors in the course. And a young woman who was a marketing major, I asked her, she came up with the answer. She said she didn't know that they were pillars of an old railroad. She just said, well, I see that there are trees behind all of those things in the photograph, and there are none on the front. And I think that's because the water's flowing away from us, and any trees that would try to live on the front of those things would get washed away by the floods, whereas they have an opportunity on the back. Perfect answer, using common sense and an intuitive understanding of opportunity and biology. If you look at this, if I said, all right, I'm a big native plant designer, and I think it'd be really cool to have native trees on this side of these piers. Well, you could plant a tree there and another tree and another tree, and all you'd be doing is wasting resources, native or not, because when that water flows, it's going to wipe every one of those trees out. On the other hand, if you said on the lee side of that pier and the other piers, I'm just going to drop a few seeds and they'll stay there, and some of them will sink into the ground and they will become 100-foot tall trees, which is exactly what happened. So we need to become more astute with reading landscapes, whether they be post-industrial landscapes, as essentially this is. This is now in the heart of the preserve, or something close to a pristine wilderness, which of course never really existed. But we need to be looking at these things and what can we do now that is meaningful, that is useful, that is helpful. This is a long camera shot. It makes it look like it's a circle. That's the old Pomeroy Railroad bed. Doug and I use these photographs in the Living Landscape book. There's lines in the landscape. And we were actually out there walking this that day that I took these. And, you know, Doug is a behavioral ecologist and an entomologist. And so we were looking at the fact that there's wild ginger along the old rail bed. This was in the steam era. But for me, what was important is that the only native trillium that we have in this part of Pennsylvania or northern Delaware is Trillium cernulum. And Trillium cernulum has been largely overtaken by Japanese stiltgrass, growing in a lot of what used to be its habitat. But on this edge, along that old railroad track, there are new populations of Trillium cernulum, which I count as a win. And Doug said, you know, I think I know what's going on. The seeds of Trillium are dispersed by ants. And ants, it's not that they're lazy, but they like really friable soils. And you can't get a more friable soil than an old railroad track where it's mostly ballast with lots of air spaces. And so it's probably ants finding the ideal habitat along that former track that is making new habitat for Trillium. You need to look at something like this and read it. I was doing this with students the other day, saying, okay, I could tell you I designed this meadow garden in the middle of a woodland clearing, but no, it's just regenerative stuff. It's old farms up in New York State, derelict now because farms on that scale don't work. You can't have a 200-acre farm and make a living out of it. But you might know that all the evergreens in the background have been there. The birches are opportunists that are growing at the sunny edge. But if I said to you, what is this green in this line in the foreground? You need to be good enough, if you're really working with native plants and native communities, to know, and this would be true for you or for me, there are a limited number of shrubs that are going to inhabit a place like that. There's a slope, there's a derelict gravely. You can see the slope in this image. That's a little bit of a drainage there. So this happens to be salix, willows. It could be alders. It could be a shrubby dogwood. But it's really important to get to know how plants naturally organize themselves according to opportunity so that you can guess at what might make sense in a designed landscape. I've been working with the Frank Lloyd Wright site, Falling Water. He built a house for the Kaufman family in the middle 30s out in Western Pennsylvania. And on my way out there along Route 68, I am delighted. Anytime I have to go out there in late April, it's just magical because I see this scene, which was blasted out of solid rock. And it is the most incredible redbud garden that I know of. They are growing literally out of rock fissures. And redbud is a native plant for Missouri, for Kansas, for me, but it is also an opportunist. It's a native that is saying, global warming, what me worry? No, they can grow in an amazing array of habitats that really would press the limits of what we would say is the ideal habitat for redbud. And it's really important to be looking at which plants, which specialists are adaptable, what specialist habitats we can conserve, but also with these generalists that are highly functioning, broadly sustaining species, how do we invite them? If I said to you, who planted all these? What would it cost to plant this many redbuds along a Virginia highway? Just think about it. We're just coming back this spring from camping in Virginia, in West Virginia, and there are thousands and thousands of redbuds blooming and not a single one planted. So if you talk about resource consumption to get that many flowering trees out there, not too many. And if you look at what redbuds do in a detailed way, there is a native bumblebee of sorts. There are little collided bees. These are solitary ground nesting bees. They're all over red buds. We have red buds in our garden. I have a drone. I'm using the drone here, not as a helicopter substitute, but to explain the way we cover the ground in our garden, the way red bud fits. This red bud we did not plant. We have red buds that I got from Darrell Apps years ago from a strain that was hardy in Wisconsin. Planted one in the back of the garden and it seeds in, it comes true. We are relaxed enough to say, that's okay. We're not going to keep every red bud seedling, but we let it do that. And that tree is a spontaneous seedling. There's that space. At the back of the garden, this tree down here is the original red bud that I got from Darrell back, decades ago. And these other trees are seedlings that we have allowed to grow there. If we let every red bud that's seeded into the garden grow, we probably would just have red buds here. So this is intervention. It's strategic intervention. You are tending, you are caring, you are stewarding. What you're not doing is maintaining. We use the word too often. We say, oh, garden maintenance, or I want a low maintenance garden. Well, if you look up maintenance, it means preserving the status quo. And boy, talk about boring. Why would you want to devote your garden to keeping everything the same? Let it move, let it morph, let it change. But you can have a voice in it. This is a long camera shot from our glass-walled bedroom in this little 1,500 square foot house, which has some good views. Every room in the house has views into the landscape. There are 2 northern flickers, or yellow shafteds, if you will, through double pane glass and 100 yards out into the landscape. And I like the image because it says there's life out there we often just simply don't see. It doesn't mean it's not there. Back to test time. This image, is it neat? Is it messy? Is it orderly? Is it chaotic? Could you tolerate that in your winter landscape? Could you sell that to a client if you're a designer? This happens to be just the regrowth at the ground level of Aesculus parviflora. Now, some of you maybe by now have seen the bird. This is not a still image. This is a movie. The minute I make the video start, you will see another one of those flickers. Which is why when I'm teaching clients or communicating with clients, I use a lot of videos. I do not do drawings. I've been doing design work for close on 30 years without doing drawings. I use imagery. It means that you've constantly got some kind of a camera device with you so that you can capture these little moments in ways that you want to explain why they call it the yellow shafted. That's why. You can have all kinds of debate about turf. We have enough turf in this garden to walk around or roll around or play with the dog or somebody you really like and not destroy it. So it's walkable, low-growing green stuff. It's not all grasses. And because we don't use herbicides, I can take a movie with my iPhone of one of these flickers. It's right off the bedroom window. That's how I could get this close with an iPhone. And what it's doing is it's going after a very diverse population of insects, beetles, grubs, all kinds of things just below that surface. If we were spreading toxins over this landscape, that bird wouldn't be there. We've had as many as 7 of them right off the bedroom. This is what a good lawn looks like. It's walkable, but it's not perfect. Maybe it's got a little plantain in it, it's got a lot of clover in it, but tell that to a brown thrasher and see if they get upset by it. It's like, great stuff. We keep all this stuff close. We have modified our architecture in relatively inexpensive ways to make sure that we always have this stuff in our immediate purview. Because I think intimacy does not breed contempt, it breeds empathy. And the more we can see these things from wherever you are, maybe you're at the keyboard, you are aware, you're watching. You don't have to get up and get out of your way to say, oh, I think I'll go take a look at the garden. You're in the garden. I have had for, since this 20 years now, I've had an outdoor shower that I use almost on a daily basis. There are days when it freezes here and I can't use it, but I shut it off and drain it the night before. I have a little fountain out there next to it. It's a 120-year-old Murdoch. All the stonework in our garden is dry laid. So it drains and things can live in between it. I just had to take a lot of moss and seedlings out from that. That main plant there is a Hemamelis virginiana. And it's a good choice because it is a multi-stem shrub that continues, it blooms in fall for us. This is an October bloomer. There's the shower space where it's made for naked, wet feet. And there you can see that witch hazel. Witch hazels, whether it's Hemamelis vernalis or virginiana, they continually put up stems. And you can keep them at virtually any size you want by just taking out the older stems and letting new stems replace them. So it's one of these very manageable species or genera. Now, if you look at it in the wild, this is Hemamelis virginiana in the wild, you can see the architecture. It's a vase-shaped architecture. This plant for us in Pennsylvania will top out about 12, 14 feet tall. I've seen plants in Illinois that are 20 feet tall and, no kidding, have a spread approaching 40 feet. Some of you have seen this. These can be big. But look at that. There it is up at Mohonk Mountain House up in New York State, growing out of rock inside of the Mohonk Preserve. Here it is growing in a period where we had about a week of inundation, and that didn't bother that witch hazel at all. So I look back to habitats and see, what are these plants doing? How are they faring with it? Especially with all these climate events, if you want to call it. We've had a lot of challenging things going on with our weather. If you go back to the USDA plants database, it's free online, American witch hazel, Hemamelis virginiana, you can see where it grows and where it is in relationship to Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee. And you can look at the Ozark witch hazel, Hemamelis vernalis, which for many of you is your more or less local form. I wish this was more readily available in cultivation, and because it is the most fragrant witch hazel of any of them. It even beats any of the best of the Asiatic witch hazels. We have this in the little park that I showed you earlier in this presentation, Hemamelis vernalis, the Ozark witch hazel. There are some cultivars of it. Roy Klein was putting a lot of wonderful cultivars out there before he closed Song Sparrow Nursery. This is Sandra. It's yellow blooming, still very fragrant. I like them partly because our native witch hazel here, the local one, Hemamelis virginiana, only gets yellow fall color. And this is our garden. Here's a little bench spot. And these are plants of Sandra, and a lot of the vernalis routinely get a lot of ambers to red fall colors. So if you like fall color, and I do, it's a nice alternative. We grow a lot of local stuff. We look locally first to see what's out there that speaks of our region that would work in the garden. So ironwood or musclewood or blue beech, Carpinus caroliniana is local along all our waterways, an incredible horizontal architecture. It's an understory tree. It doesn't get really tall. It's really rare to see one of these things more than 15 feet tall. The wood is so hard that in colonial times, they made gears out of it for colonial machinery. Here's a pathway with it that I actually made use of in an intellectual design way when I was working with Gary Smith on the Pierce's Woods Garden at Longwood. Gary wanted to do a path along the large lake in Pierce's Woods. And Gary wanted to use the New England canoe birch, Betula papyrifera. And Pierre Dupont's niece was on the board. She said, "No, don't do that. It'll remind me of the Adirondacks. Do something else." But Gary wanted a light bark tree. So I took him for a walk. And I said, "Gary, check this out. You know, this is Carpinus caroliniana along a trail along the edge of the creek made by people fishing." And so that's what we did. We directly cribbed from that little fishing trail in the White Clay Creek, a local native plant, and did this within Pierce's Woods at Longwood. Much more structured, it's paved, but the same trees, and they're still there, and they're glorious. We have that in our garden with Lindera. Lindera is the yellow. We've learned over the years we've been here, because it's been a while, you have to brace yourself or invite or celebrate transition. And this is what we're doing in as many ways as we can. This is an area in the back of the garden that I had been using because it was full sun at the time to learn grasses that I was publishing about, because I felt it wasn't fair to be putting plants in books without really knowing them. So I pretty much grew everything that I wrote about in those encyclopedias. And so in this case, I've now been kind of released from the responsibility of having a lot of grasses in the garden. I can go back to a lot of other stuff. And so we planted one of the mountain mints, Pycnanthemum muticum, to be an agent of change, a transitional agent, because what we wanted Carpinus out there in a grouping around this circular space, basically crafted by trees. So you can see if I jump forward 10 years, the Carpinus have now got some growth on them. There's enough shade in here that it's very, very shady. I mean, pawpaws will seed themselves in there, phlox will grow in there, but the Pycnanthemum has moved out to the edge. That's okay. It's a change. And all that time, it was doing weed suppression. Other things were finding their way. The trees are getting bigger with better moisture. And there's that space out there looking from inside the Carpinus. This is the way we work. We use trees as organic architecture. So when we lost an old apple years ago, I eventually wanted to recreate a semicircular space in another part of the garden. And I thought, all right, the scale of Carpinus is right for this. And that's what we did. So we actually took one of the trees that I'd had in the back corner of the garden. I dug it bare root at the right time of the year when it was thoroughly dormant and moved it out here and got it back in place. The tree is very healthy. It's got a great root system on it. And it's a big part of that space. So when you talk about organic architecture, let's get serious about it. Let's talk about the architectural nature of our native plants because it's how they fit into functional spaces. We have to think not just I like its flowers or I like its foliage, but is it upright? Is it columnar? Is it widespreading? How tall does it get? How long does it take to get that tall? All these things go into a recipe, if you will, for long-term sustainable design. Now, this is a photograph in our garden. I took it years ago with a very, very early digital camera. I started digital photography in 1999. And I'm not recommending that you plant beech trees on 6-inch centers. But these trees were trees that started in our garden. And what we always said to ourselves is, with spontaneous seedlings, can it stay? Not a default to we'll wipe it out, but what can stay? So we said, all right, we're going to let these 3 beeches stay in this part of the garden. So we edited. We used reduction techniques. It's a kind of an addition by reduction technique to get more value by simplifying. You're editing out. And this is years later, but it's still less than 20 years later. These trees are 35 feet tall. Those beeches were spontaneous seedlings in our garden. And they're a magnificent part of the front garden. If I take the drone, and again, don't pretend it's a helicopter, just take the drone up. And I use the drone to create material that's very effective at leading clients through landscapes, because I can take them at the so-called Peter Pan view, the view that we imagine ourselves moving through the garden. This is about 12 feet. And you can show them spaces. So there is that space made of those beech trees with a lot of pawpaws that were also started from seed. You can see where pawpaws are. You are right in the heart of it. So, you know, you can grow these things. Asimina triloba is pawpaw. They're not a pretty smelling flower, but they're not that fragrant. So let the flies have them. These are pawpaws harvested in our garden. This is you can kind of see from the graininess of it. This is a scan slide that I took decades ago. And when Doug and I were working on the Living Landscape book, we wanted to show the relationship between the zebra swallowtail, which in a larval form only eats plants in the Lauraceae, which the pawpaws in that family. And so we were looking at images and I said, well, what do you think of this? And Doug said, let's use it. He said, I've never got an image like that. And I didn't know what he was talking about. If you look over here, this is a female zebra swallowtail. And Doug was the one that knew this. It's ovipositing at the moment I took the photograph. So that slide sat more than 2 decades, almost 3 decades in my archives. And then all of a sudden it becomes useful because of a new insight. Using organic architecture and just celebrating the change over time. This is that same border, if you will, and we may go to hell for growing allium purple splendor or purple sensation or something, but we've learned them in grave tie in England and we love them. And so Melinda puts them out there and they naturalize to some extent. But that same border by fall is just almost all local stuff. We have trained monarchs in this garden. You can train them. It takes time, and you have to have good treats for them. But this is a pair of monarchs here that I taught to pose for the camera. Right next to it, I think it's still okay to call this a painted lady, but this is another wonderful thing. That's not an iPhone. That's a real camera. That's a full frame Sony with a good lens on it to get something with that kind of clarity. But we delight in this kind of stuff. We delight in having garden rooms with interiors, with edges. We have sitting places that face north, that face south, that face east, that face west. Places where we can grow a great diversity of things. We can only grow aruncus a few places in this garden with the right mix of shade and sun and moisture, but we have spaces. And this is part of, we're busy people. We work a lot. We travel a lot. We have a really needy golden retriever. And so we're not looking to be out there fussing and primping all the time. We're replacing stuff that isn't adapted. So things like Heuchera macrorrhiza, it's sometimes subsumed under Heuchera villosa, is in the foreground. It's a southeastern Heuchera. It grows anywhere it's hot. I mean, if this grows in Alabama heat, trust me, you can throw all your heat at it and it's going to be just fine. Also, it's very, very cold hardy. Aster oblongifolius, or if you really insist, Symphiatricum oblongifolium, the shale-barren aster. It's a prairie species that grows into shale regions in the Virginias. And we use these as edging plants. They hold the borders, they keep the weeds down, and they make our life easy. But we follow these things into the wild. We do a lot of camping in wilderness areas in West Virginia, and that row right there, that is all that same Aster oblongifolius. There it is growing. Look at what it's growing out of. Look at how tough these things are. I get insights from looking at these plants in their habitats to say, this is pressing the limit. And if I put it in a garden, maybe it'll do this. But I know that it could tolerate that if it had to. So this is part of really making these connections and seeing how these plants contribute, whether it's a drone fly or different things. We know, and this is really simple, this isn't so much about plants, but it's the interaction of plants and other abiotic components. So my old B&D out there drilling some test kind of things in a rock that I got from my favorite quarryman. It's a very dense rock, so it's not going to leak. And then I got my $10 chisel and I chisel it out and I put it in the garden. And even a little rock, this rock is less than 3 feet wide, immediately it's habitat. Now what we've done here, so there's the house. I'm sitting at in a little cabin at the back of the garden. There is that rock with that water. And look at all these ferns. These are all cinnamon ferns. There's that aster. There's our southeastern regional pachysandra out there. And you get bird life. They would not be there if this was out there fully exposed. They're looking for some protection. They're looking for a way that they could be a little bit cloaked. But in this case, that's the same rock, and I'm hiding behind an old Farmall F12 that we have back there as a narrative provocateur. And these birds are there, and they don't see me, but they're out there doing what we hoped they would do, is getting use out of that. We have another rock that's right off our bedroom, and if you're looking closely, you notice that this is the peak of our most recent episode of the 17-year locust, if you will. It's really the periodic cicada. I think without exaggeration, we had about 50,000 of them in this landscape. And it brought the birds out for about 2 weeks until the birds just got sick of eating cicadas. But I've never before been able to I've heard them through the years. I've never before been able to get a photograph from our bedroom of the yellow-billed cuckoo, which is a local bird for us. And it was this event, this biological event in our landscape. There's another bird that I've never gotten that close to the house before, a gray-crested flycatcher. We look at bird behavior because we like birds and we like animals, and we watch. And we watch lazily because we very often don't have to change our position, seating or standing or walking in the house, because we've got views out of the landscape all over the place. So in this case, we were watching this flicker on a magnolia to the right of this image, and all of a sudden there was a cloud burst. And we watched the bird fly over to this oak. This is an oak, the same oak that Woody and Jane planted in 1951. And you can see that there was a branch up here. The branch is gone, but that branch is sticking out enough to create a rain shadow over that bird. And so that bird stayed there for a half hour, dry, in the pouring rain. This is no dope. This bird knows exactly what's going on, and its patient is looking at me now. This is through double pane glass. But this is part of the life that you see if you give yourself over to a little bit looser landscape. So we know that come January or February every year, that's the arrival of robins. The robins come. And our landscape can be frozen at this time. It can be under ice and snow, or it can be like this. On this particular day, the stone is out there. There's no snow. The water is not frozen. The following day, they all come out thinking, gee, these folks have got a place where we can get a drink and bathe if we want to. And they were joined by a bluebird. Well, guess what? That day, the water's frozen. And what you realize when you do this is that these other beings actually become somewhat dependent upon you. So you are taking on some responsibility. They have become habituated to the idea that this garden sustains them in all sorts of ways. So in that case, it's quite an artificial contrivance. We put that stone out there. The rains to keep it full sometimes. A lot of times we are replenishing that. So that day, we got a pitcher of hot water and went out there and melted the ice and filled it with water. And for a couple hours until it froze again, the birds had something to drink. This is what the view from the toilet looked like when we got this house. In a way, it was kind of like a Martha Schwartz poetic thing. Because you're looking from the toilet directly into the backside of a yew, which was planted by Woody and Jay in 1951. So to get some exercise, again, we took those yews out by hand. That's a task. And we did that. So that's the same view from the same toilet in the bathroom in this house. This is the north-facing side of the house. And we knew enough to know that on the north-facing side, there would be moisture. That residual moisture was not something we had to provide. It's just because of the shadow of the house. We planted it with cinnamon ferns and witch hazels and jack-in-the-pulpits and all kinds of stuff. If I label them for you, there's Hemamelis, Osmunda, Aracema, Pachysandra, rhododendron, Amsonia, Viburnum nudum. This is a collage, if you will, but it's a very deliberately designed morphing, changing population or community of plants that we manage, but it doesn't take a lot of time. They change in their perspectives, they change in their quantities over the years. It's been like this now for more than 20 years. But it's a way of working, understanding the relative dynamics between these. These are plants that are not doing exactly what we tell them. We're saying, well, you could do this. And then we watch what they do. And sometimes we say, no, I'm going to go back in there and make you do something else. And other times we just say, fine. So there is that same view from the roof in fall, when those Amsonia have gone through their fall color and they start standing up again. It reveals that the asters were underneath them. They have created seeds. We leave the seeds up all winter and the birds come from them. And these shots are all from that toilet window. And because we manage that landscape that way, we have resident hermit thrushes during their migratory period. We have other birds that are around all year, like a cardinal. And there's a cardinal in that photograph. I didn't see it when I took this shot, but I went out looking around. The cardinal was foraging underneath that growth. But because we leave all that organic matter there, it sees an opportunity to eat in winter free from the predations of hawks. Call it nature if you want. I just see it as the multiplicity of things and living processes. There's proof that if we leave all this stuff out there up during the winter, you can go out when it really spring starts. You can just snap them off. You don't have to use a bladed tool. And in just 2 weeks, it's going to be greening up again. This was my grandfather's. It's a Roger Tory Peterson print of towhee in a landscape. And see, Peterson wasn't upset with the idea that the landscape beneath the towhee's feet might be a bits of bark, branches, leaves, dead leaves, cinnamon ferns, jack-in-the-pulpits, violets, Christmas ferns. That's exactly what we have off that window, not deliberately. It just makes sense if you're in this part of the world. And so about 10 years ago, for the first time, we realized we have toadies in the garden. I mean, they would not have ever thought about coming into this garden the way it was when we got it. This is the male foraging, and there's the male up there. The female was in the back garden. I didn't get a photograph of her. But this is the kind of stuff that happens all the time. So what we've had to do when we have parties and days like this is we have to put a note that's saying no more than 15 minutes in the bathroom. This is just walking down the hall in the house. I just one day just noticed that out there through the bathroom, through the window, out into the landscape with that viburnum nudum. This is a good full frame Sony taking a picture from that distance. This is an A7R4 with a 400 millimeter G series lens on it. And now there's stuff that's kind of marginally local for you. If you look at where this plant Spigelia grows, it's very hardy. It will grow up into zone 3. But it comes into Missouri and Illinois, Kentucky. It's Spigelia marilandica. It's in the Loganiaceae. It's closely related to gentians. And like a lot of tubular flowers, it is a hummingbird magnet. I learned about it because it was at Longwood Gardens when I started in the 70s. And then I started seeking it out in different populations. All the literature was wrong at the time. It said it has to be in a semi-shaded space. It has to have a lot of moisture. Baloney. I have seen Don Shadow years ago took me out to see a power line on a dry slope in Tennessee. Cotinus albovatus is above, and on the ground is all Spigelia. And I thought, okay. So we got legally and responsibly plants from 3 different known populations, known provenance, put them in the garden and let them diddle. And, you know, they're growing every place now except where we first thought they might grow, but we have them truly naturalized. This is a naturalized population of what might be called an intraspecific hybrid swarm within Spigelia marilandica. These plants are approved, they're adapted to our situation in this little Pennsylvania garden. We can actually pick bucket loads of them. They make a good cut flower. And there's all kinds of stuff that we see because of them. It's not just the hummingbirds, it's stuff that perches on them. But we have hummingbirds. From June till now, it's still happening. We have hummingbirds in the garden every day on Spigelia. And you can't, in that bedroom with that glass, you can't spend 10 minutes out there any day from June when the Spigelia picks up its speed till fall without seeing hummingbirds. But look at this, nature is cruel. There's one bird and another bird chasing it. Gardens change. This is Indian grass, one of my favorite grasses. This is our garden years ago, and it's barely recognizable because we have so much shade back there now. But at that time, it was just open lawn. And so we were planting trees, and when we had through seeding, we had created a little meadow area. And I got a Farmall F12 at that time to put out there to get kids to climb on and get the parents not to sue us if they broke a tooth. Nobody did. And we loved that very much. We loved what that told about, because that tractor actually had been local. So we could say, you know, people used to use machinery like this at one time in this landscape. Now, I worked at Longwood Gardens for 20 years, and I took this slide back sometime in the 80s when they still had the old conservatory and the old sash on the old conservatory. That's all copper, hand-sheathed over old growth cedar with cross muntins and 8 divided lights in each panel. Well, while I was there, the director, who really at the time had an incredible fascination with stainless steel, they redid this conservatory to the tune of $11 million. And instead of replacing this with copper, which would have been a lot of work and a lot of expense, they replaced it with stainless steel. And I got these pieces for scrap value. I grew up with my parents having a deal with me that they would, instead of buying me weapons for my birthday, they would take me to New York City, and I would go to the Empire State Building, and I would go to the Museum of Natural History. So I have this building in my blood, and I know the shape of it, and I know the history of these buildings and their periodicity in the city of New York. And so I did this. I took those sections of conservatory sash, stood them up on end, and deliberately created in 2 parts a ziggurat that evokes the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building. And they're on axis with our bedroom. If I take you through one day, these shots are one day, just looking at that with our panic grass in the background. It's a bit of history. It's part of the cultural landscape. It's innocuous, doesn't hurt anything. It's conserving in many ways. And it makes the garden interesting so that I don't have to apologize for the fact that the grass doesn't have colorful flowers. It's another way of getting people that are seeking color or other kind of entertainment to be entertained. We know when these little rectangles appear, it's always October. They're not a year-round thing. It is habitat. Birds need perches. We grow things like Scutellaria in Cana, but the first plant that appeared in our garden, I don't know where it came from. We weren't growing it, and we got a plant that spontaneously occurred. Whether some neighbor is growing it or some wind came along. But we love to have things that we can introduce and that will then take care of themselves. We are in an area where there's a tremendous problem with stilt grass. So we have been trying in recent years to find plants that will suppress stilt grass. I know it's not going to be 100%, but we've been experimenting with Pycnanthemum muticum, which is fairly successful. The Casmanthium does better. There's Melinda. Weeding, we've kept track of how many hours it takes to weed stilt grass out of a little meadowish planting since the Pycnanthemum, and it's down by 3/4 since before we put it there. And in the meantime, you get gray hair streaks on your mountain mint. That's what the garden looked like yesterday. And I'm excited about this plant, which I actually learned about from the trials at Mount Cuba. Mount Cuba is Pam Copeland's old garden near us now, a garden open to the public. It's still a private estate, but it is open to the public, and it's all about native plants. If you haven't seen it, Mount Cuba is gorgeous, and it's got a great diversity. It's in Greenville, Delaware, Mount Cuba. You can just look it up. But they did trials on Coreopsis, and they picked one that Rick Lewandowski had found, I believe, in Alabama. Coreopsis tripteris, Melinda and I know from Pennsylvania, it normally grows 8 to 12 feet tall, too tall for most gardens, and that's not in enhanced soil. But the tripteris, they named one that in their trials was shorter. Now, to tell you the truth, this is the plant that they named is called Gold Standard. So this is Coreopsis tripteris, Gold Standard. However, I've learned enough to know that with a bit of shade in the back of our garden, I cut it to half height in late June. And then I know that at this time of year, it will only be 4 to 5 feet tall. So I'm still intervening. I'm still gardening, but it's a locally native plant, and it's just been beautiful. We were just 2 weeks ago, we're out looking at it blooming in its habitat. This is along the Youghiogheny River, about 3 miles as the crow flies from falling water. There it is in the kind of mix. And we love the connection that plants in our garden make to wildscapes that we know, to regional habitats. This is Solidago speciosa. I wish I lived where you do when I look at this plant, because this is this reaches its peak in the Midwest, and it's the showiest of all of our goldenrods. I like the fact this is a garden up in New England, and these people had the good sense to just say, all right, they're not too proud to have a clipped yew hedge, but they were letting this population of Solidago speciosa be the main view from that house. It was there. They've just conserved it. Talking about pollination really quickly through this, the people are going to be talking about pollination, but I learned a lot about this years ago, 40 years ago. This is Eclectus quadrifolia, taking this picture in West Virginia. There's a zebra swallowtail. It's taking nectar from this. It is not pollinating that plant. You need to make that distinction. This is my slide from 42 years ago, taken through a Bausch & Lomb microscope with 35 millimeter Kodachrome film. And it's recording the fact that milkweeds don't have granular pollen. They have this little thing called a pollinarium. They have masses, coherent masses of pollen grains, and they have a receptive stigma over here. And the idea is an insect catches this with the backward facing hairs on its legs and inadvertently goes to another flower and then pulls its leg through up that slit and pollinates the flower. Well, guess what? Things like European honeybees, they're too weak a flyer to do this well. So if you're really observant, you'll see dead European hummingbees honeybees on milkweeds in summer because they get trapped. They can't fly away. What you need to pollinate this is this. You need big, strong flying native bees. So when we're talking about pollinators, I would love to see us shift some of the focus from these charismatic butterflies, which I love as much as the next person, to bees. We've got to be defending bees, because if you said, look at this photograph, there's a monarch larvae eating a pod from a Asclepias tuberosa. But if you take bees out of the picture, you don't have any pollination from milkweeds. And so you don't have any monarchs because you don't have any bees. So I'm going to go speciosa on the high line. Pete Adolph introduced it there. He knows it from working with Roy Clem. The high line is a wonderful exercise. I'm going to go through it quickly, but there I am with Pete Adolph and Dale Hendricks, who started North Creek Nurseries decades ago. I knew of it before Pete did. I knew of it in the beginning when Robert Hammond and Joshua David were thinking it might be a garden. This is a few years after that, but still wild. There's Pat Klein in the photograph, and there's Judith Giespertz was on the left as an assistant of Pete's. And I was looking at this, and it was kind of a poignant thing for me, because I'm looking at this growth of Schizocarium scoparium and Eupatorium altissimum, and it's growing in a ½ inch of grit in between the ballast of old trains, and the tracks are still there, that used to be on the High Line in New York. And that had to be all wiped out because of ordinances in New York that said that they had to get rid of lead paint and they had to fix the drains. But I took these photographs of a spontaneous landscape of native species that was up there before anybody did anything. Now that's what they had to do. That's the High Line once they got started. So they wiped out literally everything that was up there. They fixed the drains, they put in garden soil, the drains got clogged again, and a lot of the species that were up there originally, like if you go back and look at this, those grasses, the Schizocarium scoparium, Andropogon virginicus, they won't grow in the soils that are on the High Line now. They're too rich. So they had to switch to other grasses like panicum. But this photograph is kind of a joke. That is actually the photograph we use on the cover of this book on the High Line. This is actually Pete's artistry. There's the actual full photograph without the crop. Pete's artistry working with Jim Corner's Field Ops landscape architectural firm, creating an evocative landscape that is something of a community of native plants, mostly native plants, although it's completely contrived. That's okay. That's what gardening is about. They took that and made it into that. It's a pretty good transition. It's been a green corridor that exposes all kinds of people to a lot of life in all seasons that they would have never seen. Midwestern plants like Silphium terebinthinaceum or Parthenium are left to their own devices. They don't clean this up. The ethos of the High Line is that they let it be out there and they let it be brown. There's the other Silphium laciniatum. They let it be out there. They let it feed the sparrows, and they let it be brown. Pete used primarily native species on this spur going over 10th Avenue because he knew that the freezing and thawing would kill so many exotic plants that are part of our exotic palette of horticulture. And it has been a remarkable success. Now, if you said, all right, you're the gardener, here's Pete's design, maintain that. You're not going to do it. You can't possibly keep that exactly the way it was. You can intervene to keep certain kinds of balance. And this is Yuki and Allende, two High Line staffers who are editing. I work with them on a lot of these messages when we were doing that book and before and after to get messages out. The High Line edits for balance. They were actually teaching directly to the public to say, this is how we manage this. These are shots from that Living Landscape book proving the kind of diversity that is supported by the regime that's up there on the High Line now. And the only caveat, these are all photographs from the High Line, all diversity, 400 species supported up there. The only caveat is that it's expensive. That's a $10 million annual operating budget to manage that landscape. And we don't have that for all the urban landscapes that need to be green and need to be functional and need to be sustaining a lot of life for all kinds of urban populations. Like I'm assuming this is father and child, and I like to think that that kid will grow up being comfortable around grasses turning tawny. We do stuff like this. This is Viola striata. It's a local violet for us. You can see it goes right through your region. There it is in the front garden. We're not lazy, but we're trying to be creative. It's seeded in, and I thought, I was taught that violets are weeds as a horticulturist in Longwood, but I love violets as native plants. There's a whole host of them all over the country. So I started saying, can we manage it? And what we've done is we've found the balance between Viola striata and things like Geranium maculatum or dogwoods or all kinds of woody things or different ferns. And there's a lot of stuff mixed in there, including the Mertensia, that all has a balance with that violet. We have different forms of the geranium mixed in there. Like the lighter one that's not as strong a color is our local southeastern Pennsylvania, northern Delaware form. The other one we got from a friend who has property in Virginia where the color is quite different. And I mean, horticulturally, horticulturists are always picking, variants of native species. That's a really good plant, but we don't care that they're all like that. We just let that genetic influx be part of our morphing dynamic population. I want to end with this project. This is a 4,000-acre parks project in Louisville, Kentucky that I was delighted to be invited in by Jim Walters, the architect, and Dan Jones, the head of the Jones family, who started Humana, and then decided Louisville, which has a great Olmsted legacy, needed more parks, 4,000 acres of free public parks, and I got to work with them on the approximate 30 acres of a woodland garden within Broad Run Park. It goes down to the Floyd. They have almost the entire watershed of the Floyd there. This is one of our local limestone dry laid paths that we made. There was no landscape architect in this project. I was working directly with Jim Walters of Bravura and other architects in his office. We did inventory for about 3 years. I had then invited Tom Smarr, who was at the Highland, and Tom actually left the Highland to come work with us full-time as head horticulturist in Louisville. And these were pawpaws that were on the site. There was a whole raft of things, all regionally native. There's Verbicina alternifolia and Vernonia novaboracensis. Those of you that know your native plants and your cultural landscapes know that the reason those two plants are on this is because it was a dairy farm. And these beasts find both those plants unpalatable. So we made sure that they were part of our post redo, that they are part of the legacy. These are humans not feeling embarrassed at me saying, pretend you're a tree. We are making rooms within edited rooms to tell people about seeing the organic architecture of that space. This is a room made from cedars that were there. We did edit some out. There's Kentucky coffee tree rondelle. We call the spaces rondelles. Some of them are edited, some of them are planted. This is a rondelle in the entrance that I use Kentucky coffee trees. Jim did the stonework. We got a local person do all that dry stones, local limestone. There's Gymnocladus dioica, the Kentucky coffee tree, and that first rondelle. It's a karst landscape. You know them from Missouri. There's a lot of limestone there, and with limestone comes sinkholes. So a young architect in Jim's office said, since you're going to keep the sinkholes, let's celebrate them. So they did this almost like a cut curbstone ceremony about the sinkholes. So that those rooms there are all edited from trees that were pre-existing. There were hundreds of thousands of Jeffersonia diphylla on that property, and we made sure that they were kept and that there was access to them. So we called it Twin Leaf Ridge, put a dry laid path in there, and then Jim, working with this local quarryman, designed a dry laid bridge. There's no mortar in that bridge. And there it is the week after we opened it. And you can see how little collateral damage there is. I got a chance right before COVID really stopped everything down. I got a chance to do a tour along with Tom Smarr and Jim Walters. And this family was out there, and this young girl I don't know how old she is. She's 4 or 5. She's with her mother and 2 brothers, and the mother wants to go straight where most people are going. And this little girl wants to go up that path. She finds something intriguing up there. Well, the little girl won. And I thought, this is wonderful, because what we're trying to do with that is be as conserving as possible, use as light a touch as possible, let the existing plant communities exist. And she somehow intuitively knew that that path was going from in here out to the Scarlet Oak Rondell. I don't know how she knew that, but she just sensed that there was something intriguing up there. And to me, that's success in design. When we do our stonework in this little residential property, we do it like this. There's the front northern facing little patio extension off the front door. It's on dirt or soil, call it what you want. But we knew this plant, the bluets, around here they call them Quaker ladies, we knew that it would grow in moss. It's a biennial or sometimes an annual. It's not a perennial. But we knew that if we just let the moss, which would come in a north-facing place off the house, the moss came in between those interstices because they weren't mortared. And then you get these little rosettes of Houstonia cerulean. And these things are only 1/8 of an inch across. You really need to watch to make sure that that seed is set before you rake it or leaf blow or do anything that would get these plants out of there. But if you relax into that, this is a managed population within that front bit of our garden of bluets. And maybe that's not what you're really interested in, but even the most formal gardener, it's hard to say that's not beautiful. And there's no way you can have something like this without understanding the process. So maybe this is just a few ideas of what you can do in a residential property to really embrace the idea of wildness within that home habitat that is your own. So I'm going to give this screen back.
Great, Rick. Thank you very much for an inspiring keynote and a tremendous way to open up our Planet Native Conference for this year. I just want to remind everyone that Rick will be around at 2:30 for office hours. So if you have any thoughts or comments, questions, please tune in at that time. Otherwise, we have other sessions starting immediately. Thank you all.